Boldwood presents The Child I Long For, written by Caroline Finnerty and read by Caroline Lennon. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood.
Part 1. Chapter 1. The pungent smell of incense scratched at her throat and cloyed in her nostrils. Emily was trying hard to hold it together, but like a charcoal cloud ready to spill its rain, she was on the brink of falling apart. In the centre of the church stood her mother's coffin, and her breath caught every time her eyes landed on the lacquered timber. It was hard to believe that the mother that she had loved dearly, the woman who was always so full of life, was inside there. It had been over 10 years since Emily had last sat in a church, but now, as all the old pain came rushing back again, it only felt like yesterday. As she thought back to that awful time when the bottom had been ripped so cruelly from her world, she recalled the despair so viscerally, the bleakness that had filled her heart. She felt a sob catch in her throat as the pain hit her afresh, and did her best to swallow it down, afraid that if she started to cry, she might never stop. The organist began to play Be Not Afraid, and she wondered who had chosen the music. Her sister Karen, she guessed. Or perhaps, she thought wryly, the musician had a standard playlist for funerals. Karen was sitting on the pew beside her, doing her best to keep her 3 children under control. But as the mass wore on, they were starting to grow restless. She had 2 little girls, named Kiva and Cara, and a pudgy-cheeked baby boy named Sean. Kiva was 7, while Cara was almost 5. They were all beautiful children. The 2 girls were dressed in matching navy dresses, and their amber-coloured hair was tied back with gross-grain bows. Karen was bouncing Sean on her knee. His cheeks were flaming red. "He's teething," Karen had explained earlier with a sigh. Yesterday had been the first time that Emily had met her nieces and nephew. Having not been home for almost 10 years, she had only ever seen them on FaceTime up until now. "Would either of you like to say a few words?" the priest asked from the altar, startling Emily from her thoughts. Karen was looking pointedly at her, and Emily felt her body tense. I can't," she whispered, feeling panicked as her sister's eyes bored into her. Karen hissed. "But we told Father Flynn that we'd do a eulogy." "But I thought you were going to do it," Emily trailed off. "Why did you assume I would be the one to do it?" Karen retorted, before nodding pointedly towards the baby that she was jiggling on her lap. "Besides, Sean is going to scream blue murder if I leave him to go up there." "I mean, I guess I could," Emily offered half-heartedly, feeling her heart start to thud wildly inside her ribcage at the prospect of walking up onto that altar in front of the packed congregation. "It's okay, I'll do it," Karen snapped, after a sigh laden with impatience. She brusquely handed the baby over to her husband, Dave, and Emily tucked her knees to the side to allow her sister to squeeze out past her. Immediately, Sean began to cry just as his mother had predicted. As the baby howled, Karen made her way up onto the altar, and Dave bounced him on his knee in a bid to keep him quiet. Emily felt terrible for leaving it to Karen to give the eulogy, but she hadn't spoken in public in such a long time that she was afraid she would freeze if she stood up there. There was a time once in her life when she could have stood up there with ease. She had regularly spoken to hundreds of people in a room without giving it a second thought. But these days, the very idea overwhelmed her. Besides, she knew she'd never be able to keep the tears at bay up there, with the entire eyes of Ballyrath Church looking up at her. Things had been tense between Karen and herself ever since Emily had arrived back in Dublin the day before. Emily knew there were a lot of old wounds still festering between them, and now their mother's sudden death had come like a scalpel, sharp and swift, and reopened them. Silence fell on the church as Karen stood behind the lectern and adjusted the microphone. A screech of feedback reverberated around the vast space, and then Karen began to speak. Emily watched her sister, her athletic frame, dressed in a simple black shift dress, and her auburn hair tied back in an elegant chignon. Karen looked just like their mother, whereas Emily had inherited her father's looks. As she listened to her sister speak, Emily felt a wave of emotion rise within her, as Karen brought to mind their mother. The things she had forgotten, like how she had been so particular about their table manners when they were children, and had insisted on the girls wearing matching clothes right up until their teenage years, which Karen had loved, but Emily, as the older sister, had detested. But as Karen talked about her mother's life more recently, it felt to Emily as though she was talking about a stranger. Why hadn't Emily known that her mother volunteered at the local resource centre that catered for disadvantaged families? Or that she had recently taken up playing bridge? Or that her team had won a golf tournament just 3 weeks ago? She usually spoke with her mother once a week, but they were always fleeting conversations due to the time difference. She would be waking up and her mother would be going to bed. A wave of shame consumed her. Why hadn't she asked her more questions about what she was up to in her life? Taken more of an interest? The congregation began applauding as Karen finished her eulogy and returned to her seat. "You did great," she whispered to her younger sister as she sat down beside her and took Sean onto her lap again. Karen pinched her lips together in a tight smile, and once again, guilt whacked Emily. When the mass came to an end, the coffin was hoisted onto the shoulders of the pallbearers, and the sisters followed behind it as they made their way outside to the churchyard, where heavy rain was teeming from the sky. They did their best to dodge the puddles as they trudged along the path that led to the cemetery next door. As they reached the plot where their mother was to be buried, the smell of freshly dug earth hung sickly sweet on the damp air. The undertakers had laid the bouquets and wreaths brought by sympathisers on top of the mounds of sticky clay. She noticed one that said, "Nanny Pat," spelled out in white roses. Karen must have organised that from her children, she thought. She looked around at the people gathered there, crowding beneath umbrellas. She saw aunts and uncles and cousins she hadn't seen in years, but there were so many more people she didn't recognise. Her mother had been active in the community, and now Emily realised how well thought of she was, how many people knew and respected her. Her mother's coffin was lowered into the ground, and then the priest blessed it with holy water before he began a decade of the rosary. Emily recited the familiar words which had been imprinted on her brain since childhood. When the priest had finished, a steady line of mourners began to crowd around her sister. Emily watched as they shook Karen's hand and mumbled well-worn platitudes. "Sorry for your troubles. So sorry for your loss. She's in a better place now, Lord rest her." In her time away, Emily had forgotten the rituals of Irish funerals. How people liked to shake hands with the mourners and offered their condolences face to face. Emily watched as they squeezed her sister's hand and hugged her tightly. But when they reached her, it was like they had forgotten she existed. It felt as though Karen was the chief mourner and Emily merely a minor side character. "Oh, Emily, it's yourself," they would say when they noticed her. "I didn't know you were back." Or, "I didn't recognise you after all these years away." She accepted their condolences, feeling like a fraud. She realised with searing shame that she felt like an interloper at her own mother's funeral. Eventually, the crowd filtered away until it was just themselves left. "Emily, will you give the priest some cash, please?" Karen asked. Emily was shocked. We have to pay him? No, Karen sighed. It's just what people do, to say thanks. But I didn't bring any money with me. I only have my bank card. Karen exhaled heavily yet again and shifted the baby up on her hip. She rooted in her crossbody bag and removed her wallet. She opened it and pressed a €50 note into Emily's hand. I've no idea what the going rate is for tipping priests, but hopefully he'll be okay with that, she muttered. Thanks, Emily mumbled, feeling more than useless as she accepted the money. How did Karen think of all this stuff? It would never occur to her to give money to the priest at a funeral, but Karen seemed to know the right way to do everything. She was always so well organised, so together. Emily made her way over towards the priest as the gravediggers began filling in the void over her mother, heaping crumbly earth on top of the coffin. Crows squawked overhead as they waited on their opportunity to scavenge the soil. She had almost reached the priest when she saw the outline of a man that was familiar to her, and she stopped dead. Surely not. She must be wrong. Her breathing quickened, and she felt her stomach clench. Although he was standing beneath an umbrella and was facing away from her as he chatted to someone, she recognised him immediately. It was the unmistakable width of his stance and the gentle slope of his broad shoulders that caught her eye. It was definitely him. But what was he doing here? She hadn't expected to see him today. He turned around just then, but he didn't see her, so she was able to study him properly. She was momentarily transfixed by him. She noticed that he wore his hair longer now, and it had started turning grey around his temples. He had a few more lines on his face, too. She had once known that face better than she had known her own. Her heart stumbled, and she hated that he still had an effect on her. Just then, his eyes found hers, and she felt everything stop. The pitter-patter of the rain as it landed on the nylon of her umbrella disappeared. The sound of chatter around her faded. The birds screeching grew distant. Her senses sharpened until it was just the two of them left there in this graveyard, standing beneath the falling rain. Her eyes moved down along his familiar body, and it was only then that she noticed it. Someone was holding his hand. The hand of a little girl was slotted inside his. A little girl that should be hers. Chapter 2. Emily felt winded, like he had walked straight up to her, drawn back his fist, and punched her in the gut. Why had he come here today? How could he be so insensitive? Surely he must realise that it was still painful, even after all this time. She watched as he and the little girl made their way towards her. She wanted to get away from him, but her legs were rooted to the spot, as if her brain couldn't send the message to them to move, to run. Her throat became constricted. She tried to search out air, but she couldn't pull it into her lungs. They were getting closer to her, but her feet wouldn't budge. And suddenly, the pair of them were standing on the rain-sodden grass before her. Emily, he began, his eyes locking on hers. I'm so sorry. Don't, Rob. She put up a hand to stop him. Please don't. Just go. He lowered his gaze to the ground. I'm sorry, he began. I shouldn't have come. He shook his head. I guess I thought it would be okay. He tugged gently on the child's hand. Come on, Molly. It's time to go home. Daddy, she asked in a sing-song voice, why is that woman being mean to you? Daddy. The word seared an imprint on her heart. This was his child. Rob had a daughter now. Come on now, love, he coaxed. We have to go. The child looked up at him in confusion, and Emily couldn't help but admire her. Her hair fell in soft golden waves around her shoulders, and she had the most arresting blue eyes, just like his. She watched as he clasped the little girl's hand inside his own as they began to walk away. Just as her breathing began to recover, she felt someone tap her on the arm, and she turned around to see a diminutive, silver-haired woman standing alongside her. "Ah, Emily, there you are. I'm so sorry for your loss." She stretched out her arm and began pumping Emily's hand. She was similar in age to her mother. Emily vaguely recognised her, but couldn't remember her name or what the connection was. "It must have been terrible, getting that news all the way over in New Zealand, and you on your own like that," she began. Emily nodded and went through the motions, as she had done so many times over the last few days. Her head was spinning with everything that had taken place. Burying her mother, and then coming face to face with Rob and his daughter. "Thank you, I appreciate it," Emily mumbled. "It's Mrs. Mannion," she prompted, obviously noticing that Emily didn't know who she was. "I play, well, I guess it's played now, golf with your mother, although you might not remember with you being away for so long. At least Patricia always had Karen close by. She was very good to her." "Ah, yes, Mrs. Mannion, of course I remember you." "Thank God it wasn't dragged out," she continued. "There's a lot to be said for that. My Finton was sick for 3 years before he died. Your mother probably didn't even know what was happening to her. Please God, it was all over before she even realised it. When my time comes, that's the way I want to go too. It must have been tough though all the same. You didn't even get the chance to say goodbye. You just never know, do you? We all take life for granted, but none of us know what the future has in store for us." She tutted and shook her head. "Yes, I suppose so." Emily was finding cold comfort in Mrs. Mannion's words. Ever since she had got the call from Karen to say that she had found their mother unconscious on her bedroom floor, she had been tormented by thoughts of her final moments. Had she felt unwell? Had she known she was dying? Had she tried to get help but wasn't able? "Excuse me, Mrs. Mannion, I have to go," she said, releasing Mrs. Mannion's hand. She needed to be away from this woman and her clumsy words. Chapter 3. 3 days earlier. Emily lay in Johnny's springy double bed, with its geometric-patterned duvet cover and matching pillowcases, their skin clammy with sweat. She was just about able to make out the contours of his face in the dawn light that was breaking behind the curtain. Emily and Johnny had a thing, if you could even call it that. He was a chef at the restaurant where they both worked. Sometimes the staff would stay back for a few drinks after closing, and they usually ended up going home together. As she looked around the small room, at his built-in wardrobes where he hung clothes on the corners of the doors so they didn't close properly, she felt him stiffen beside her. His breath stilled, and she knew there was something he wanted to say. "Emily," he began eventually. "Yeah? You know my brother's getting married next month," he went on, and she could hear the nerves playing with his voice. "Uh-huh," she nodded. He had mentioned it to her before, several times. She knew he had been dropping hints at her, but she had deliberately pretended not to pick up on them. "Well, I was wondering if you might come with me, as my +1. "Oh, Johnny, I don't really think... I wouldn't really know anyone. Sure, you'd have more fun without me." He propped himself up on one elbow and turned to look at her face on. The tan on his bare chest was accentuated against the pale bed linen. He owed his dark skin to his Tongan mother. "Please, Emily," he begged. "I'd like you to come. I'd like you to meet my family. They're really nice, I promise." He smiled at her. A smile that said so much. A smile she wished she could take for herself, to be her smile, whenever she opened her eyes in the morning. But there was something stopping her from reaching out to it. She knew that that feeling could be hers to keep if she wanted it, but there was something stubbornly insistent within her that wouldn't allow it. I don't think it would be my scene. I'm sorry, Jay. Come on, Em. We've been like this for months now. Don't you think it's time we made things more serious between us? Emily felt herself freeze. How do you mean? She asked, buying herself time. Well, I'd like us to officially become a couple. I hate running around behind people's backs in work or acting like there's nothing going on between us. I'd like it all out in the open. I guess what I'm saying is that I want you to be my girlfriend. Sorry, I know I sound like a corny teenager. He laughed awkwardly. But I'm serious, Emily. I want us to be a proper couple. A lock of his black curly hair fell in front of his eyes. She reached out and brushed it back off his face. Come on, Johnny, we both know it would never work, she said softly. It's just a bit of fun. Maybe to you it is, but not to me, he retorted. I don't get you. He shook his head in frustration. Why won't you let me in? He asked. I don't know what happened to you in the past, whether it was a bad breakup or what, but I wish you'd give me a chance to prove to you that I'm serious about us. He lowered his voice. I would never hurt you, Emily. I'm sorry, Jay. It's not you. I just can't. Sometimes she would catch him looking at her across the pass in the restaurant, like she was a puzzle he just couldn't figure out. She hadn't told him anything about what had happened before. He would often ask her questions about her life in Ireland. He would ask her about her upbringing and her family, or what had made her decide to move to Auckland. And she would fob him off with the story about how she had wanted a change of scenery, and then divert the conversation to another topic, like some gossip from the restaurant or a new movie that she wanted to see in the cinema. He flopped back down on the bed and exhaled heavily. Do you know something? I've wanted to say it for a while now, but the timing never seemed right. But what the hell? Now is as good a time as any. I think I'm falling in love with you, Emily, he said. Emily's heart sank. Did he think this confession of his love was going to change how she felt about him? Perhaps he hoped that by being candid with his feelings, she would feel safer about opening up to him. But instead, it had the opposite effect. It made her want to run. She had told him before that she wasn't ready to get into something serious, and yet he always seemed optimistic that perhaps in the future she would change her mind the longer they were together. No, you don't. I do. I love being with you. I love this. Having you lying beside me. I love you. She stayed silent. Aren't you going to say it back to me? He challenged. As she continued to remain mute, she could feel his body tense with frustration as he balled the duvet with his fist. I'm sorry, Johnny, but I can't change how I feel, she said eventually. He exhaled heavily and rolled over, turning his back towards her. She pulled back the covers and got out of bed. Where are you going? He asked, turning around again. Why don't you just stay the night? It's nearly morning anyway. I need to get back to my own place, Emily said, moving around the room and gathering up her clothes. She proceeded into the bathroom and dressed herself. She returned after a couple of minutes, wearing the same black trousers and a long-sleeved black shirt that she'd worn to work the previous evening. She sat on the edge of his bed and tied the laces on her trainers. I just don't get you, he repeated furiously. You've never once spent a full night here. You know, if you like having your own things around, you could leave some stuff here. We've been through this, she said, as she picked up her bag. She leant over the bed to give him a kiss, but he sulkily dodged her face. He had never been like that with her before. Johnny, please, don't be like this, she begged. What is it that you want, Emily? He demanded. What do you mean? He shook his head. Maybe you could explain it because I just can't understand it. Why won't you allow yourself to be happy? Do you want me to treat you badly? Is that what you want? Would you like me then? Because if that's what you want, it's not going to happen. Call me old-fashioned, but I wasn't raised that way. I'm sorry, Jay. Her voice was a whisper. I'm sorry I can't be the person that you want me to be. Emily walked out of his bedroom and headed down the narrow hallway, squeezing past his bike, where the black rubber handles had streaked the grubby white wall. She left Johnny's flat feeling consumed with self-loathing. Why did she do this to him? It wasn't fair. She really wished she could make things work between them, but there was something inside her, stopping her from letting it grow into something more. She liked him. He was kind and caring. He was fun and she enjoyed his company, but did she love him? She didn't think so, if she was being honest with herself. Johnny was a good person, too good for her. He would realise that eventually. He wanted more than she was able to give. She knew she should have ended it long before now, but somehow she hadn't been able to face it. And so they had drifted along like flotsam and jetsam. Every few weeks he would bring it up with her about them making their relationship more concrete. Invariably, they would have a version of the same conversation where he would get annoyed with her and they would stay apart for a few days. Then he would catch her alone in the kitchen and say he missed her, and she would go back to his place that night after service, and they would continue along in the same pattern, thinking they were moving forward, but both knowing that they weren't. Not really. Chapter 4. Emily returned home to her own flat as the sun rose in a fiery ball over the city. She climbed the concrete staircase that led to the third floor, put her key in the lock, and let herself in. The one-bedroom flat wasn't spacious, and it was located in a less desirable part of the city, where homeless people regularly slept on the street outside. But it was all she could afford on her meagre wages from the restaurant. It was hard to find places to rent in Auckland, and if you did, rents were usually extortionate. Instead of climbing back into bed, she decided to throw on her running gear and head for a jog around the city streets. She loved this time of the day when the city was still half asleep, as it started to wake up. She pounded the empty pavements, savouring the solitude. In another few hours, these streets would be thronged with people making their way to work. There was already heat in the morning sun, and she knew it was going to be another hot one. The iconic Sky Tower stretched up over the city, piercing the brilliant blue sky, making the other skyscrapers look diminutive in its shadow. Elegant colonial buildings stood proudly beside modern tower blocks, a snapshot back to another era. She stopped at traffic lights and took a moment to catch her breath and wipe the sweat from her forehead before the lights went green and she continued on again. She headed down by the waterfront, where motorboats and yachts bobbed in the harbour, their moorings whipping in the gentle breeze. She saw traffic was already building on Harbour Bridge. She looped around towards home, the stench of urine rising off the street as she let herself into her building. After she showered, she fixed herself some breakfast. She pottered around for a while, and soon it was time for work. She entered the restaurant kitchen later that day, feeling the heat hit her like a wall. The chefs had started work several hours ago, and already beads of sweat laced their brows as they concentrated on their work. Between the hot summer weather outside and the warmth in the kitchen, the place was like a furnace, no matter how high the air conditioning was cranked up. "Hi, everyone," Emily greeted, as she breathed in the heady aromas of that evening's service. "Hey," they chorused, without raising their heads. She looked over to where Johnny was expertly chopping asparagus. He raised his head and gave her a half smile, and she felt her heart twist. She had been feeling bad about how she had left his place that morning. Johnny was a good guy. It was just a pity she couldn't give him what he wanted from their relationship. "Emily," he said, following her out to the back of the kitchen where she went to hang up her coat. He glanced behind himself to make sure no one was listening to them. "Look, I'm sorry about this morning," he began sheepishly. "I shouldn't have been like that. I was just frustrated. I wish you would give us a chance, that's all." "I'm sorry too, Johnny," she said sadly. How she wished she could be the person he wanted her to be. They noticed Henry the head chef watching them as he tenderised steak. Johnny cocked his head back towards the kitchen. I'd better get cracking. We've 64 covers booked in for tonight. It's going to be a busy one. Emily nodded as she took her notepad and pen out of her shirt pocket before heading out front of house to begin taking orders from customers who had started to arrive for dinner. Before she knew it, she was run off her feet, her brain in a chaotic tangle as it tried to remember extra requests that customers liked to throw at her as she passed their table. Can we get some ketchup, please? Can you tell the chef to put the sauce on the side? Could you bring more wine? Could I order an extra side of the char-grilled broccoli? She knew she and Johnny would both go about their jobs and continue on as if nothing had happened. Not out of any lingering awkwardness, but because this was the way it always went with them. He would probably bring it up again in a few months. She would give him the same response, and so the cycle would continue. A while later, she was standing at a table, twisting a corkscrew into a bottle of wine, when Barry, the manager, came over and said there was a phone call for her. Emily was surprised because nobody ever called her at work. They always phoned her on her mobile. She finished opening the wine, waited while the woman who had ordered it sampled it, going through the routine of swirling and sniffing, eventually taking a sip and nodding her approval. Then, finally, when she had filled all the glasses for the rest of the table, she headed behind the bar area and lifted the phone. "Hello," she said. "I've been calling your phone." She heard her sister Karen's voice launch straight in without even a greeting. "Karen?" she asked, feeling a chill spread down along her body and the hairs on her arms stand to attention. Why was her sister calling her on this phone? "What is it? What's wrong?" "It's Mum. We think she's had a stroke." The words were buzzing in her ears. "Oh God, is she okay?" "You need to get home." "Is she okay?" Emily repeated, hearing a tremble in her voice. "I'm sorry." Karen dissolved into tears. "Just come home." Emily replaced the phone on the receiver and wandered back out to the restaurant in a daze. One of the tables she had been serving were glaring in her direction. They wanted her attention. I'm sorry," she said, quickly hurrying over to them on autopilot before she remembered that she had to get home. Then she turned away from the table and ran back of house to find Barry in the kitchen. She explained that there was an emergency and she needed to get back to Ireland. "Emily, are you okay?" Johnny asked, placing down the knife he was using to chop and coming over to her. "You look like you've seen a ghost." She shook her head, unable to form the words. "It's my mum," she blurted. "They think she's had a stroke. I need to get home." "I'll go with you," he said quickly. "I mean to Ireland." "I can help you get your stuff packed up. Come on, let's go." She nodded, grateful to have him help her when her brain was in a spin. Johnny ran and got her coat and bag from the staff area, and then the two of them hurried out of the restaurant. On the street outside, he walked onto the road and flagged a taxi. They went back to her flat and she scrambled around trying to pack a few things and grab her passport. "I've a taxi waiting downstairs," Johnny announced as she came out to the living room a few minutes later, carrying a small suitcase containing her belongings. "Thank you," she said, feeling a huge surge of gratitude for him. "Let's go." He lifted her case and they headed down in the lift wordlessly together. On the street, he opened the rear door of the taxi. She climbed in and he followed after her. The city lights, streaked neon, passed the window as they drove towards the airport. Eventually, they pulled up outside the terminal building. "I'd better go," she said, climbing out. Johnny followed after her and stood on the pavement beside her. "You know, I could go with you," he hesitated. "I mean, only if you wanted." "I don't think. Not like that," he added quickly. "I mean, just as a friend. To keep you company." "Thanks, Jay. I'll be okay. But thank you for being with me tonight." He nodded. "Take care of yourself, all right? Let me know how she's doing when you get there. I'll be thinking of you." "I will. And thank you. For everything." He pulled her into a hug, and she breathed in his manly scent, combined with a faint trace of the aftershave he always wore, and food smells from the restaurant. She released him, and he got back into the taxi while she headed inside the building. Eventually, she managed to get on a flight to Dubai, which would then connect to London and on to Dublin. As she sat in her seat on the plane, images of her poor mother lying on the floor, or surrounded by bleeping machines in a hospital bed, assaulted her. Karen's words had sounded serious. She prayed that her mum would hold on. She must have eventually fallen asleep because she was startled awake somewhere over the Indian Ocean by a nightmare where her mother was calling out for her daughters and they had stood there ignoring her. She called Karen as soon as she landed in Dubai, and from London too, hoping for an update, but Karen said she still hadn't woken up. When she finally got to Dublin over 24 hours later, since she had left Auckland, she jumped in a taxi and headed straight to the hospital, where Karen told her it was too late, that she had already passed away. "She's gone," Karen sobbed tearfully when she entered the ward. Emily prayed that it had happened quickly and that she hadn't lain on the floor, lingering in death. Chapter 5. Emily was bone tired as she let herself into her childhood home that evening after the funeral. They had left the graveyard and gone back to her mother's golf club, where Karen had organised a buffet lunch for the mourners. She marvelled at how composed Karen managed to remain as she shook hands with people clutching plates of chicken curry and beef stroganoff and accepted their condolences. She always seemed to know the right thing to say and had a word for everyone, whereas Emily felt as though the earth that had covered her mother's coffin had filled her in too. Her brain felt like congealed soup. She couldn't think straight or form the words to respond to people. She had met relatives she hadn't seen in years, and they had made polite chit-chat and told her stories about how they had recently bumped into Patricia on the golf course or at the supermarket. But when Emily wasn't able to hold up her end of the conversation, they soon ran out of things to say to one another, so excused themselves and moved on to talk to Karen. The house was cold, having been left empty all day, but the biscuity smell was as familiar as it was comforting to her. As she walked down the hallway, she realised she was waiting to hear her mother's sing-song voice calling out to her. "I'm in here, Emily. Sit yourself down there and I'll stick the kettle on." She noticed that her mother's bottle green woolen overcoat was still hanging on the hall stand, as if waiting for her to come downstairs and slip it on. It felt like walking into a stranger's house. It wasn't home without her mother here waiting for her. Guilt choked her as she thought about how it was almost a decade since she had left. Every year, her mother would ask, her voice laden with hope, if she might be coming home for Christmas this year. Emily always disappointed her with some feeble excuse about having to work because it was the restaurant's busiest time of year, or not being able to afford the cost of flights. She knew now she would regret it forever. Her mum had been in her 70s. She should have visited her. Emily should have known she wouldn't always be around, and to cherish the time with her more. The truth was that although she missed her family, she just hadn't been able to face coming back to Ireland. It was easier to keep postponing the visit and fob her mother off with various excuses and a promise that she'd definitely come home to see her the following year. Emily desperately wished she could see her mother one more time. She would apologise for everything. She would hug her and tell her that she loved her. She would listen to her stories and updates about what was happening in their village without getting impatient. She would tell her that she was sorry and how much she meant to her, but now she was gone and it was too late. Emily entered the living room, which had been done up since she was last home. She remembered her mother talking about that, something about there being a delay with the furniture shop delivering the new sofa, after she had donated her old one to the St. Vincent de Paul, and how she'd asked the manager of the shop if he expected her to sit on the floor while she waited. Emily hadn't paid much attention to her mother's banal updates, but she wished she had. She hadn't realised it at the time, but they had made her feel connected to home. Now she knew that no one was going to do that for her. No one was going to check in with her, or just sense when something was wrong. Karen was busy with her children, and her dad had left when they were young. Like a lot of families in those days, their father had gone to England for work in the 80s because of the high levels of unemployment in Ireland. He had been working on a building site in Coventry, but he had met someone else over there and told her mother by letter that he wasn't coming home. They had never divorced. Emily wasn't sure why, but perhaps it was something to do with the fact that divorce was only legalised in Ireland in 1995, and by that stage, neither of her parents had the energy to reopen old wounds. They knew that her father had a new family now, and neither she nor Karen had a relationship with him anymore. After her father had left, the three women had banded together. They had been so tight in those days. "Us Gallagher girls have to stick together," her mother would always say. So how had they all drifted apart? As she watched her sister accepting condolences earlier, it was obvious that Karen and her mother had retained that same closeness that she had walked away from. Despite her absence for the last 9 years, her mother had always been at the end of the phone when she needed her. Patricia had been the one constant in her life, and without her, she felt so lost and at sea. She looked up at the collage of photographs that her mother had displayed proudly on the wall above the sideboard. There were school photos, as well as communion and confirmation photographs of both girls. Her dad had still been in Emily's communion photo. He hadn't left at that stage. But he was gone by the time her confirmation had rolled around. She stood up and moved closer to a photo of her taken at her graduation from university. She was wearing a black cloak and mortarboard, holding a scroll with her marketing degree inked in Latin. She had had caramel highlights in her sandy-coloured hair, and her skin was bronzed after spending the summer previous working in Ios. She looked so different to what she looked like now, young and carefree. There were professional black and white portraits taken of each of Karen's 3 children as newborn babies, and beside it was a wedding photo of Karen and Dave taken at their reception. It was only then that she noticed that her own wedding photo that had once hung here too had been taken down. Emily sank down onto the sofa. She was so weary, but she knew she'd never sleep if she went to bed, and even if she did, she was afraid of the fresh pain she would face when she woke up again and remembered that her mother was gone. It felt as though she had been upended by a wave that kept battering her, and every time she tried to get her footing, it would wipe her out once more. Seeing Rob earlier hadn't helped. She still couldn't